Hello, everybody, and happy First Chapter Friday on the 1st. So, First Chapter Friday on May 1st. Pretty exciting stuff. I know, you're just on the edge of your seats. You're like, well, what book should I pick? And this week's First Chapter Friday, I'm going to dedicate to my Uncle Jack, who had a birthday this week. And he's just like fresh 67, like rockin' life, and one of the sweetest men ever. So this First Chapter Friday is for you, Uncle Jack, and I hope you enjoy it. So the book that I've chosen this week is also one of my mom's favorites. It's called In Order to Live, and it's a North Korea girl's journey to freedom by Yeonmi Park. And so this is what she looks like. One of the reasons this book is so interesting to me is because she was born the same year my sister was born, so I'm only like a few years older than her. And so it's really hard to like wrap your head around the fact that like we're almost the same age and our lives are so different just because I was blessed to be born in Canada. There was a video that went viral a few years ago, and it's of her, and she's wearing traditional North Korean dress, and she's like speaking out about like the atrocities that happen in North Korea and trying to like free it. And her Instagram is really interesting. She right now, especially that like there's rumors that Kim Jong-un is dead or not, and she keeps like posting about it and saying that it's like probably not true and he's probably like hiding out from corona or what have you. Also in this book there's a lot of like images, and so you can kind of get a glimpse into like what her life might be like. And yeah, so there's a picture too of like her and her sisters, and she's just a very smart woman, and this is her when she was like 8. But I've read a few different North Korean like women escaping, and like the books The Girl with 7 Names is also really good. And just the fight to freedom is so hard, and it's hard for me to understand why in our world we like let places like North Korea exist and let all these people suffer and live an existence that is treacherous and ungodly. But yeah, so she now lives in not North Korea, New York. And she's a student at Columbia University, and I know just following her Instagram that she is married and she has a young son, and she is just like this teeny tiny little woman, but full of strength and vivacious energy, and she is so beautiful. And yeah, and so you can kind of see too, like in the start of the book, there's a map. So, because she keeps talking about all the different places she had to kind of go, because a lot of people will like go to China first and then go to South Korea or whatever. So you can kind of like, obviously, you should know your geography. Okay. And I'm probably going to butcher some of the names of these places, but I will try my best. So don't judge me on that part. On the cold, black night of March 31st, 2007, my mother and I scrambled down the steep, rocky bank of the frozen Yalu River that divides North Korea and China. There were patrols above us and below, the guard posts 100 yards on either side of us, manned by soldiers ready to shoot anyone attempting to cross the border. We had no idea what would come next, but we were desperate to get to China, where there might be a chance to survive. I was 13 years old and weighed only 60 pounds. Just a week earlier, I'd been in a hospital in my hometown of Haisan along the Chinese border, suffering from a severe intestinal infection that the doctors had mistakenly diagnosed as appendicitis. I was still in terrible pain from the incision and was so weak I could barely walk. The young North Korean smuggler who was guiding us across the border insisted we had to go that night. We had paid some guards to look the other way, but he couldn't bribe all the soldiers in the area, so we had to be extremely cautious. I followed him in the darkness, but I was so unsteady that I had to scoot down the bank on my bottom, sending small avalanches of rocks crashing ahead of me. He turned and whispered angrily for me to stop making so much noise, but it was too late. We could see the silhouette of a North Korean soldier climbing up from the riverbed. If this was one of the bribed border guards, he didn't seem to recognize us. "Go back," the soldier shouted. "Get out of here." Our guide scrambled down to meet him, and we could hear them talking in hushed voices. Our guide returned alone. "Let's go," he said. "Hurry." It was the early spring, and the weather was getting warmer, melting patches of the frozen river. The place where we crossed was steep and narrow, protected from the sun during the day, so it was still solid enough to hold our weight. We hoped. Our guide made a cell phone call to someone on the other side, the Chinese side, and then whispered, "Run." The guide started running, but my feet would not move, and I clung to my mother. I was so scared that I was completely paralyzed. The guide ran back for us, grabbed my hands, and dragged me across the ice. When we reached solid ground, we started running and didn't stop until we were out of sight of the border guards. The riverbank was dark, but the lights of Chiangbai, China, glowed just ahead of us. I turned to take a quick glance back at the place where I was born. The electric power grid was down, as usual, and all I could see was a black, lifeless horizon. I felt my heart pounding out of my chest as we arrived at a small shack on the edge of some flat, vacant fields. I wasn't dreaming of freedom when I escaped from North Korea. I didn't even know what it meant to be free. All I knew was that if my family stayed behind, we would probably die. From starvation, from disease, from the inhumane conditions of a prison labor camp. The hunger had become unbearable. I was willing to risk my life for the promise of a bowl of rice. But there was more to our journey than our survival. My mother and I were searching for my older sister, Yeonmi, who had left for China a few days earlier and had not been heard from since. We hoped that she would be there waiting for us when we crossed the river. Instead, the only person to greet us was a bald, middle-aged Chinese man, an ethnic North Korean like many of the people living in this border area. The man said something to my mother and then led her around the side of the building. From where I waited, I could hear my mother pleading, "Año, año, no, no." I knew that something was terribly wrong. We had come to a bad place, maybe even worse than the one we had left. I am most grateful for two things: that I was born in North Korea and that I escaped from North Korea. Both of these events shaped me, and I would not trade them for an ordinary and peaceful life. But there is more to the story of how I became who I am today. Like tens of thousands of other North Koreans, I escaped my homeland and settled in South Korea, where we are still considered citizens, as if a sealed border and nearly 70 years of conflict and tension never divided us. North and South Koreans have the same ethnic backgrounds, and we speak the same language, except in the North, there are no words for things like shopping malls, liberty, or even love. At least the rest of the world knows it. The only true love we can express is worship for the Kims, the dynasty of dictators who have ruled North Korea for 3 generations. The regime blocks all outside information, all videos and movies, all jams radio signals. There's no World Wide Web and no Wikipedia. The only books are filled with propaganda telling us that we live in the greatest country in the world, even though at least half of North Koreans live in extreme poverty and many are chronically malnourished. My former country doesn't even call itself North Korea. It claims to be Chosun, the true Korea, the perfect socialist paradise where 25 million people live only to serve the supreme leader Kim Jong-un. Many of us who have escaped call ourselves defectors because by refusing to accept our fate and die for the leader, we have deserted our duty. The regime calls us traitors. If I tried to return, I would be executed. The information blockade works both ways. Not only does the government attempt to keep all foreign media from reaching its people, it also prevents outsiders from learning the truth about North Korea. The regime is known as the Hermit Kingdom because it tries to make itself unknowable. Only those of us who have escaped can describe what really goes on behind the sealed borders. But until recently, our stories were seldom heard. I arrived in South Korea in the spring of 2009, a 15-year-old with no money and the equivalent of 2 years of primary school. 5 years later, I was a sophomore at a top university in Seoul, a police administrator major with a growing awareness of the burning need for justice in the land where I was born. I have told the story of my escape from North Korea many times, in many forums. I have described how human traffickers tricked my mother and me into following them to China, where my mother protected me and sacrificed herself to be raped by the broker who had targeted me. Once in China, we continued to look for my sister without success. My father crossed the border to join us in our search, but he died of untreated cancer a few months later. In 2009, my mother and I were rescued by Christian missionaries who led us to the Mongolian border with China. From there, we walked through the frigid Gobi Desert one endless winter night, following the stars to freedom. All this is true, but it is not the whole story. Before now, only my mother knew what really happened in the 2 years that passed between the night we crossed the Yalu River into China and the day we arrived in South Korea to begin a new life. I told almost nothing of my story to the other defectors and human rights advocates I met in South Korea. I believed that somehow, if I refused to acknowledge the unspeakable past, it would disappear. I convinced myself that a lot of it never happened. I taught myself to forget the rest. But as I began to write this book, I realized that without the whole truth, my life will have no power, no real meaning. With the help of my mother, the memories of our lives in North Korea and China came back to me like scenes from a forgotten nightmare. Some of the images reappeared with a terrible clarity. Others were hazy or scrambled, like a deck of cards spilled on the floor. The process of writing has been the process of remembering, of trying to make sense out of these memories. Along with writing, reading has helped me order my world. As soon as I arrived in South Korea and could get my hands on translations of the world's great books, I began devouring them. Later, I was able to read them in English, but as I began to write my own book, I came across a famous line by Joan Didion. We tell ourselves stories in order to live. Even though the writer I came from such different cultures, I feel the truth of those words echoing inside me. I understand that sometimes the only way we can survive our own memories is to shape them into a story that makes sense out of events that seem inexplicable. Along my journey, I have seen the horrors that humans can inflict on one another, but I've also witnessed acts of tenderness and kindness and sacrifice in the worst imaginable circumstances. I know that it is possible to lose part of your humanity in order to survive, but I also know that the spark of human dignity is never completely extinguished, and that given the oxygen of freedom and the power of love, it can grow again. This is my story of the choices I made in order to live. Oh my gosh, this book is just like killer. And it's just amazing that she made the choice to tell her story and to speak out against the regime, which she was like trained to fear. And it just shows like the power of that like human strength to persevere and not forget her past, like a terrible past, but instead to face it head on and heal from it and then let others know. So I encourage you to like check out her Instagram, maybe like read up a bit on North Korea, and realize that like this is happening now and these people are suffering still to this day. And that is the first on the first. Okay, so I'll see you guys next week. Bye.